Right, hi everybody. So in place of our Teams meeting today, I'm just doing a short video for you. Well, shortish. So I'm going to just go through and I'm going to discuss all the different themes and the questions that are involved, and try and address a few questions that I've had in terms of how you set things out, the sorts of ideas that you need to look at, and things like that. Now, in terms of ideas, initial ideas that you have, on page one. They need to be really vague. I need to make that quite clear. They don't need to be super clear. You don't need to say, I'm going to be making a small table with a pop-out section, blah, blah, blah. It's not about that. At this point, I'm quite happy for you to make statements such as, I think that a device for locating you if you get get separated from your group or anything like that sort of stuff. So being very vague, because that kind of device doesn't really tell you anything, but it is important that at this point it's just some initial ideas. Okay, I don't need you to design what you're going to be making for your end product. Now, your end product in terms of the non-examined assessment is going to be a prototype. Okay, so this is a first version, something that can be tested in some way, that you can make potentially at school. Okay, now for some of you, if you did come up with something that's a little bit bigger than we can reasonably fit into the workshop, it is possible to make a scale model. So we wouldn't necessarily have to make it at full size. You could make something slightly smaller just to show the sort of effect that it would have. Okay, and I can think of some examples and I'll try and talk them through as we go. So this is for the contexts that are released on the 1st of June 2020. This is not for any other context or anything else, so please, if you're watching this at some point in the future, if I don't take it down, then please don't use these contexts if you are doing it at a later date. Okay, so it's only for the year that's going 2020 into 2021. Right, so these are the contexts that have been released by the exam board. Ignore this first page. Really, it just gives you an idea of the sort of thing that you're supposed to be doing. The idea is that it's an iterative process, that it is a design process that's kind of cyclical, and you can sort of watch it as it goes. Right, so here we go. All design technology happens within a context. It's important for designers to understand the context they are designing within, as this will impact on the wants and the needs of users as well as the requirements of the design. Remember, you are making for someone, not for yourself. Okay. Designers often need to find innovative solutions to design challenges, and they look for inspiration from many places to come up with ideas. Often these design challenges relate to ways in which improvements can be made to the lives or environments in which people live. Below are 3 themes, each with 2 contextual challenges. You must choose one contextual challenge to explore and respond to through your assessment project. This is posted on Teams in the files section. If you want to get to it, that's where they are. If you can't get them, then please email me and I'll send them straight to you. So, theme 1, climate emergency. Now, when you're setting this out on your first page, I would expect you to tell me which theme you're doing. So if you literally write theme 1, climate emergency, and then you need to copy out your question. You don't need the A or B, but you need to copy out the question exactly as it's written here. So how can products be used to increase our awareness of climate emergency, and how can products be used to promote a more sustainable lifestyle? So both of these are about sustainability, really. Now, in terms of contextual challenge, question A, how can products be used to increase our awareness of climate emergency? Well, realistically, the sorts of things I want you looking at on the first page is going to be just kind of figuring out who needs to be told about climate emergencies. Now, obviously, there's absolutely no point in you just saying I'm going to do it for everyone. You need to try and identify some key groups. So you could put in some age ranges or generalized kind of comments about the sorts of people that you might be aiming it towards. I would suggest probably a good response for most of you, if you wanted to choose this one, would be looking at ways of teaching children potentially, or even kind of maybe you'd want to aim at manufacturers. So in terms of teaching children about a climate emergency, you need to find an engaging way to do that. Now, a lot of children learn really well through play, So it would be quite reasonable for you to start to think possibly about the idea of creating some sort of a toy or a game that would teach them something about what a climate emergency is and what we can do about it. Now, in terms of climate emergency itself as a term, we're really talking about things like global warming, we're talking about the ice caps melting, we're talking about that sort of stuff. We might be talking about increased sun exposure, we might be talking about rising sea levels, we might be talking about natural disasters such as tsunami and stuff like that. Okay, so all of those things are things that you can talk about on your first page. So you could have little bubbles that come off and say, you know, areas to look at or areas to research or something like that. Now, it's a good idea on your first page to have little bits about research and stuff like that. That's quite a useful little bubble to have. So further research that you're going to do. At this point, you wouldn't have to say what that is. You just need to say that you're going to look into it. You're going to look into these areas. You're going to look into what climate emergencies there are and so on and so forth. You might look at the age range. So you might look at, I don't know, maybe you look at primary school children and you list the ages that they start at. So most children start primary school between 4 and 5 years old, and they would normally finish sort of between 10 and 11 years old. So you might be looking at an age group of 4 to 11-year-olds potentially. You might be looking at potentially something that they could do, you know, perhaps it's an activity they could do with their parents, so their parents have to support them to do it. It might be something that they can do in a playground environment. It might be something that they could do individually as a toy or something like that. Now, in terms of what you're actually making, you will be making a prototype, so you'll be making a thing to test, all right? So you need to be really clear about that. So you're not making a huge thing. I would probably steer away from things like play apparatus and stuff like that, because that gets very large and very expensive very quickly. But you could be looking at something that's a classroom card saw or a jigsaw or something like that. Yeah, so that's a potential. If you're looking at the manufacturing sector, you might be trying to create a very cheap, simple product that you could send out to big manufacturing firms, to their CEOs. Perhaps it's a little key ring, or perhaps it's a little pop-up thing. There's some great things you can get these days that are... do apologise for the noise in the background, there's traffic around today. You could be looking at, you know, so there are some things that you can get through the post. I had something my sister sent me, she thought it was hilarious, that actually is folded flat, but it's made in such a way that when you open it and you take it out of the envelope, it then pops open and it shows you something. So you might send something like that that actually would make that CEO stop and think about how are they contributing to the carbon footprint for their company. That might be something that you could look at. You could look at lots of different aspects. So remember, safety is going to come into a lot of it. Materials will come into it, but again, at the moment, I wouldn't expect you to be massively clued up about every material that could be there, but you could talk about materials that could be appropriate. So for instance, you might want to think about materials that could be used outside. So you might think about plastics, you might think about surface finishes for woods and stuff like that. Yeah, you might think about metals that don't rust, alloys, that sort of thing. So you could put little bits like that all around on your first page, and it is just, your first page is you thinking out loud. What is this question and what do I need to look at? What kind of things does it initially throw up? So you might have some initial ideas, but like I say, you want to be talking about a device or a game or an activity, as opposed to saying I'm going to make a jigsaw. Yeah, that's a bit too specific at the moment. Now, for question B, how can products be used to promote a more sustainable lifestyle? You could be looking at all sorts of different things. You might look at different polymers that can be used using biosources, so things like PLA filament and so on and so forth, or degradable plastics. That might be a thing. It might be that actually you're looking for something that can be recycled again and again. That might be something that you might want to think about. So I would suggest that on your first page you need to have something that says that you're going to look into what sustainability is. So as a bit of further research, you want to look at what sustainable is, and all that kind of stuff. You want to be looking at perhaps producing items, everyday items, from a more sustainable standpoint. So you might look at ways that they're made. You might look at ways they can be recycled, or how recyclable things are, because remember, there's, even in the best product, there's only going to be 90% of it that can be recycled. So you need to be looking at end of life is something that you need to be talking about. So actually having a little bubble saying end of life disposal, so then you can sort of link off to have recycling. You could have perhaps it could be broken down, used for something else, so on and so forth, or perhaps it could just be used for something else. I've got a bread box that I use for my letters because I don't use it for bread. That was a reasonable thing to do with something that otherwise would have just been left to gather dust and just sit there and do nothing. That might be something you could think about. You could also think about, there's a quite a big thing these days, and I talked quite a lot with some of the students when we last had a video meeting about sort of upcycled furniture. So you could look at that and actually make a big point of it, of saying, I'm going to include some sort of packaging that tells the consumer how they can dispose of things, where their products come from, and how sustainable they are, and get them thinking about a more sustainable lifestyle. You might even look at potentially, you see quite a lot of it around at the moment with gardening programs and stuff like that, that actually, a lot of people are quite interested in growing their own fruit and veg, which is quite a reasonable thing. So you might be looking at creating a sustainable planter that can be used for growing things. There's a great video on YouTube at the minute about a lad in America who was quite interested in making aeroponic growing apparatus. So which basically means that it's not planted in soil, it's actually grown in the air. So he's found ways to grow sort of standard salads and that sort of thing in the air. So so it's getting watered, but it's not actually in soil. That's something that you could look at. You could look at perhaps a game again. So you could have a game about sustainability. You could have products that are sort of telling people more about different areas of sustainability. It might even be a kind of a slightly interactive sort of sign or something like that. That might be a way of possibly looking at it. These are just some ideas, and obviously I'd like you to be as creative as possible and think about as many ideas as possible. And I'd like to see them on your first page, but they're not. It's not desperate that you have too much of that on your first page. Or, well, the ideas you have should be vague at this stage. They shouldn't be, I'm going to make that. And please don't fall into the trap of just coming up with one idea and saying, yes, but I want to make that, because that's not how this works. All right. So that's theme one. Theme two is about cinemas. Now, this is a tricky theme for you guys, because in terms of you making a product that is innovative, creative, new, it's a little bit difficult, because actually most of these things, there have been a lot of products that don't often change very much, that potentially just exist, and actually I think the amount of work you can produce will be quite limited. So we'll just have a quick look at them. So how can products be used to encourage people to visit the cinema? Well, at the minute they use big kind of cardboard cutouts. They use kind of flyers and posters and things like that. You might look into some sort of smart tech. So perhaps an app that attaches to your phone that maybe sort of will ping up with the latest thing. But I'll be honest, you guys creating apps, very, very limited, and you're unlikely to be doing that. All right. In terms of you producing posters and stuff like that, so you might just make a flexible poster system so that you can sort of easily slot the latest poster into it, and it's got some automated stuff. Maybe it's got like a USB thing, so you can press a button and it will tell you what's on and what time it's showing and where it's showing and stuff like that. That might be a possibility. But as I say, I do think that as a theme, unless you've got some particularly amazing ideas, this could be quite difficult for you to get a decent amount of work out and obviously get a good grade for. The other question is, how can products be used to improve the experience of people at a cinema? Well, this is somewhere where you need to look at what problems people have with the cinema. So it might be access, that might be an issue. So for people with kind of impairments or disabilities for getting into a cinema, it might be that actually you look at something that could potentially sort of work to help them. It might be something that, for instance, you might talk about somebody who perhaps is in a wheelchair and can't get out of it. So, they would go into the bit at the front. I'm sure you've seen that if you've ever been in a cinema. And yet, it might be that actually you could create something that easily clips onto a wheelchair that allows them to hold their drink properly, or something like that. That might be a possibility, or perhaps their popcorn, or something like that. Yeah, it might be a simple thing just to kind of aim their chair back at a certain angle so that they can see the screen a bit more clearly. It might be that actually you are adapting a cinema seat for somebody who doesn't have an impairment to make it much easier for them to get in and out of it. There's lots of different things that you could do. But as I say, in terms of my own opinion and how this will potentially translate into a product and something that will get you a good grade, I think there's a lot of ideas that will come out of this that are going to be kind of graphic products. So it's going to involve you designing something on the computer, on a piece of graphic software, and getting it printed out and all that kind of stuff, which is tougher with the sort of facilities that we've got. But it's not impossible. If you want to do it, then by all means discuss it with me, but it would be a little bit more difficult. Right, theme 3, the coast. Well, this is quite a nice wide open one as well, so I would probably say my favourite ones personally, in terms of the 3 themes, would be theme 1 and theme 3. So the contextual challenges within this, so how can products be used to preserve wildlife in coastal areas? That's quite big and broad, so that's quite nice. And how can products be used to stay safe at the coast? So we'll talk about A first. So how can products be used to preserve wildlife in coastal areas? Well, you first off are going to need to kind of define the sorts of creatures that tend to be in wildlife, as wildlife in coastal areas. So you might think about things like sea otters, you might think about seals, potentially. There's quite a lot of them in this part of the country, that's worth considering. The other area is kind of birds, so the RSPB often have quite a lot of nature reserves near coastal areas. I mean, actually we've got one at Welney, which arguably is probably not a bad source to look at, or certainly not bad people to talk to, and see what kind of things they've already done, because they have a lot of wading birds and stuff like that, and it's a very similar environment to what it would be a little bit closer to the coast, and obviously they're situated on a tidal river as well, so you could probably push it that actually that's an area you're going to look at. So instead of coastal as in right next to the sea, you're looking at coastal as in near the coast, affected by the coast. You could look along those sorts of avenues. Again, you want to be looking at the sorts of organisations that might have something to do with that. So I would say someone like the RSPB would be a good person to potentially look at later, and I dare say we could probably get an interview with somebody from the RSPB to help us out with that. Which is something I'll help you with, so don't worry, I'm not going to force you to go off and do that yourself. But you can look at lots of different options. So there are schemes for encouraging coral growth, for instance. So you could look at a product that could be easily made in a modular fashion, so sections that could be put together to create something much bigger, that potentially you could sort of encourage coral and stuff like that to grow on, which will add to the biodiversity of the coastal area, and also creatures like corals or mussels or any of those kind of feeder shellfish actually are quite good because they clean out a lot of toxins from the water and all that kind of stuff, so that's quite useful. You could be looking at birds, obviously, so we could be thinking nesting boxes for specific species to encourage them to stick around, so that we don't lose that. So if we're losing habitat, we could do that. You could look at floating bird boxes, for nesting boxes for certain creatures to keep them safe whilst they're nesting from other water animals. So that gives you some nice ideas in terms of sizes. So you'd have to think about, when we're talking bird box and stuff like that, you need to look at the sort of birds you're looking at, in which case you need to think, right, can that animal get in, and could a bigger one, a predator or something like that, not get in there? So that's a possibility. And you could look to sort of nature for some inspiration there. So you could look at how kind of lily pads work, sort of floating on the surface of the water and stuff like that. Again, in terms of products you can look at existing stuff, so that there are products out there that kind of do that job already, so you can look at them and to adapt them. And this is something that you kind of need to take on the chin, that actually what you're designing doesn't have to be brand new, but it needs to be slightly innovative or creative, in which case you can take something that exists and you can add something to it. So it might be that perhaps you have a bird nesting box, but instead of them having to go out and manually check it, perhaps it could have a little Bluetooth camera system in there that's solar powered, or perhaps it could just have a little trigger that when CO2 gets to a certain level, it knows that there's an animal in there, and it can notify the appropriate people to know there's a creature there, to know to look after them, or to keep their distance from them, or something like that. So that's a possibility. You could look at sort of animals that have been in decline. So you might look into kind of things like water voles or water rats, or certain species of otter, or maybe things like certain lobsters, or sea life in some respect, that are dying out in a particular area because of loss of habitat, or because of increased sort of traffic from sort of water vehicles and things like that, that's polluting the area. Or it might be a way of actually looking at restricting pollution from a certain area. So you might look at a particular character like Boyan Slat would be a really useful person for you to look at, and see what he's been doing about talking about oceanic plastic and stuff like that. It might be that you're going to design something that could help you pick up litter from the breakwaters so much easier. That could be a useful thing for you to look at. Quite a simple thing of a particular type of grabber that can grab hold of more items easily, and therefore more people could get involved in cleaning up beaches and stuff like that. It might even be that you look at producing toys, activities, so on and so forth, for children, to encourage them to go on a litter pick, or maybe understand the sort of creatures that are there, and to get an understanding to grow up to then want to work with them and preserve them that way. Yeah, so that, as I say, that's got quite a lot of scope in there, and there's lots of different areas you can look at. I certainly can't cover them all, but they're all ideas. So remember, on your first page, I want to see the sort of areas that you need to look at, the sort of things that initially spring to mind, any initial ideas, and make them really, really clear. You can have pictures on there and stuff like that. That makes it really good. One thing I would say to all of you is make sure that you are looking at the NEA page guide, and make sure that you are actually paying attention to the text sizes that you're supposed to have on your pages. Those few of you that have sent me some stuff have pretty much just been using size 18, which is not going to get you a lot on a page. And remember, if you look on the first page on my first video where I was telling you how to set it up, or on the first page of the NEA guide, it does specify main title 18, subheadings then size 12, and any other text should be a size 10. So please do remember that. And in terms of the coast, question B, so how can products be used to stay safe at the coast? You've got to define what safe means. And there's lots of different areas, and think about key activities. I think that would be a good place for you to start and to help you to structure it. Think about the activities you can do at the coast. So there is kind of water sports and stuff like that. That's quite a reasonable area to look at. There's obviously water there, so there's inherent dangers there. So I think one thing you're going to have to look at is the hazards. Okay, so having a nice bubble of hazards would be a really useful thing for you to look at. You could be sort of talking about the different activities that you can do at the coast. So if you think about it, there's kind of, there's obviously water sports, there's kind of swimming, and there's surfing, and going in boats, and inflatables, that sort of thing. So there's always the danger of possibly being swept out to sea. So if we think about things like rip currents and stuff like that, we think about the tide as well, people getting stranded by the tide. That's quite a key area. So that's all quite handy. Yeah, so these are things you can look at. You can look at being on the beach. So there's some inherent problems there in terms of kind of sun damage. So you could talk about sunburn or that sort of thing. So you might look at products that maybe give you a bit of a timer for how long you can stay out in the sun. It might be that you set up your little camp on the beach a little bit too close to sort of the water line and that sort of thing. Just, so a simple product like a water sensor that would go off if the tide starts coming into a certain area, that just sort of spikes in the ground. And you may or may not know this, but typically the water will actually start to make the sand wet even before it actually gets that far. It starts to seep up through the sand at the same time, or you might have it just so that actually if a wave actually goes onto it, it makes a sound or sends a message to an app or something like that. That's all quite reasonable. Again, we can talk about devices as opposed to anything else. You can talk about a device for telling you how long you can stay in the sun, or a device that would tell you when the tide's coming in, that sort of thing. You could look at it in terms of the current situation with COVID-19, that actually there's an issue there with, I've seen it on the news, I'm sure most of you have, with idiots going on the beach. So they're going out and they're gathering in large areas and they're not keeping proper social distancing. So how can you look at encouraging people to keep a better distance, or even just helping them to keep a better difference? So you might look at a way of measuring between yourself and somebody else. You might look at a way of something that just automatically gives an audible warning if somebody is closer than 2 meters from you. You might look at different ways to sort of, you might look at ways to go for a walk along the beach with lots of other people. Perhaps there's a way of adapting a current face mask to be much better at not allowing that virus to transfer. Those are things that you can potentially look at. Yeah, so that's all quite reasonable. So you could look at things like, there are existing products like laser tape measures. You can adapt that quite easily to measure the distance between you and the next group of people, so on and so forth. So you keep your 2 meter separation and that sort of thing. So that's all quite reasonable stuff. You can look at, so in terms of water sports and stuff like that, there's that, every year, having grown up in Cornwall, I know there's a huge amount of people that go out into seas that are too rough for them, or they go out not knowing there's a rip current and then end up getting swept out to sea. Perhaps you could have a waterproof device that would have things like GPS in it, so people would be able to know where you are at any given point. So if you got separated from your group, people would know where to find you. It might be that you possibly have something like, you might have some other things on there. So once you go further than a certain distance out from the coastline, perhaps it gives an audible warning, or perhaps it sounds an alarm when you're out there. You can turn it on, it sounds an alarm so people can locate you. Perhaps it's got a flashing light on it so people can locate you. You could then look at products that it might attach to, so stuff like paddle boards or dinghies or anything like that, to help people. It might be something extra that you can sort of add on to a life jacket. It might be something like that. That's all perfectly reasonable things. But don't forget about simple pleasures that you might find at the coast. Things like, you could look at it in terms of safety. I don't know how safe or not it is, but you could kind of look at, being able to eat stuff safely. So simple things like, your ice cream melting. Is there a way to stop that from going all the way down you? Is there something you can sort of hold the ice cream in that would, if it starts to dribble, it will just kind of go into that so that it doesn't go all over your clothes? That's quite a reasonable thing for you to look at. You could look at kind of other creatures, so you might be thinking about wildlife that might be at the coast. So if any of you have ever been to the coast, I guarantee you there's quite a high possibility that you may well have encountered the lovely world of seagulls, who don't seem to give a monkey's whether the food is yours or not. They will quite happily come and dive bomb you for it. Perhaps you could have some sort of a thing that you could put over yourself so that you're covered from above, so that the seagulls can't come flying down and steal something off you. Or maybe not for yourself, but maybe it could be added to, say, a pushchair or something like that, so it stops children from being scared by these animals coming down trying to get stuff. You might look at things like, in the middle of summer, potentially, there's a huge sort of increase in the wasp population and around bins and stuff like that. So some people would put stuff in the bin and wouldn't necessarily be able to sort of safely do that. So is there a way of trying to encourage the wasps from going further away? Is there a product that repels them, or is there something like, you can get wasp traps that have little sweetness in there, so that they go in there and they end up drowning? Is that something that you could have sort of above a bin, or would attach higher so that it keeps them away from people? They're all reasonable things for you to look at, but don't forget about things like coastal walking, with erosion and stuff like that. Sometimes these paths become a bit treacherous. Perhaps there's something that you can do in terms of that. That's all quite reasonable stuff for you to look at. Okay, so there's lots of different options there for you. It's about you interpreting the design context, and then producing something a bit more useful from it. But at this stage, it should be really vague. I don't want you going too mega on it. And page 2 is all about you just going, what is this problem all about? And there's a really good example on the NEA page guide for you to look at that should really help you with that. Okay, so I hope I've answered some questions as well as talked you through the themes. If you have any specific questions, please do get in touch and please do let me know. Yeah, good luck, and keep talking to your teacher and make sure that you're sort of having that open communication at this stage. Okay, thank you.